The laughter echoed through the packed Manhattan courtroom at exactly 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon that would forever change American legal history. District Attorney Marcus Richardson, a 58-year-old prosecutor with a reputation for ruthless cross-examinations and an ego to match, had just finished ridiculing what he called amateur hour legal analysis from White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt regarding the Sean Diddy Combs federal case. His condescending chuckles were captured by every camera in the room, his smug confidence radiating as he dismissed her observations as the naive ramblings of a political hack-playing lawyer. But within 72 hours, that same laughter would haunt him as Karoline's seemingly simple analysis would uncover a conspiracy so deep, so meticulously hidden, that it would topple one of the most powerful prosecutors in America and expose a web of corruption that reached the highest levels of the justice system. The controversy began during what should have been a routine White House press briefing. Karoline Leavitt, now in her second year as press secretary, had developed a reputation not just for political acumen but for her surprisingly sharp legal insights, a byproduct of her pre-political career working for a small law firm in New Hampshire. When asked about the federal case against Sean Combs, she had offered what seemed like a straightforward observation. Having reviewed the publicly available documents in the Combs case, Karoline said, adjusting her glasses as she looked down at her notes, there appear to be some procedural irregularities in how evidence was collected and processed. Specifically, the timeline of warrants doesn't align with the timeline of seizures, as reported in the initial filing. It's probably just clerical errors, but in cases of this magnitude, every detail matters. The comment was measured, almost offhand, the kind of technical observation that would normally be forgotten within hours. But this was not a normal time, and Sean Combs was not a normal defendant. The music mogul's case had captivated the nation, with allegations of racketeering, trafficking, and abuse spanning decades. Every aspect of the prosecution was under intense scrutiny. Marcus Richardson was in his downtown Manhattan office when his assistant rushed in with a tablet showing the clip. Richardson, a man who had built his career on high-profile prosecutions and media attention, watched with growing irritation as political commentators began picking apart Karoline's comments. "Sir," his assistant, Jennifer Walsh, said nervously, "some legal analysts are starting to discuss her observations. Should we respond?" Richardson's face darkened. He had spent 3 years building the case against Combs, had staked his reputation on this prosecution. The idea that some political princess, as he had privately called Karoline in conversations with colleagues, could second-guess his work was intolerable. "Get me on CNN," he said, his voice sharp with anger. Tonight. By 8 p.m. that evening, Richardson was sitting across from Anderson Cooper, his silver hair perfectly styled, his $3,000 suit impeccable. When Cooper brought up Karoline's comments, Richardson's response was swift and devastating. "Anderson, what we're seeing here is the Dunning-Kruger effect in real time," Richardson said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Ms. Leavitt, bless her heart, has confused reading court documents with understanding the law. She's a political operative, not a prosecutor. The idea that she could spot something that my team of 47 experienced federal prosecutors missed is frankly laughable." The camera caught Richardson's smirk perfectly, an expression of such pure arrogance that it would become a meme within hours. "I've been prosecuting federal cases since she was in elementary school," he continued. "Sometimes political figures should stick to politics and leave the real legal work to the professionals." The interview went viral immediately. #Rich Arts and Laughs began trending, with supporters of the prosecutor sharing clips of his dismissive comments. Legal Twitter was divided. Some agreed that Karoline was out of her depth. Others defended her right to comment on public court filings. Back in the White House, Karoline watched Richardson's interview in her office, her jaw tightening with each condescending word. Her communications team gathered around, some suggesting she let it go, others encouraging her to respond. But Karoline's mind was elsewhere, focused on the nagging feeling that had prompted her original comment. "Pull everything," she told her aide Sarah Chen. "Every public filing, every warrant application that's been unsealed, every timeline that's been reported. I want to see it all." "Karoline," said her deputy, Mark Stevens, "you don't need to prove anything to this guy. He's just protecting his turf." But Karoline was already deep in thought, her legal training kicking in. During law school, she had excelled at document analysis. finding patterns and inconsistencies that others missed. It was a skill that had served her well in politics, but she hadn't used it for legal work in years. For the next 18 hours, Karoline barely left her office. She spread court documents across her desk, created timelines on whiteboards, and cross-referenced every date, every signature, every procedural step in the Combs case. Her staff brought her coffee and sandwiches, but she barely noticed, lost in the maze of legal paperwork. What she found made her blood run cold. The warrant for Combs' Miami mansion was dated March 15th, but according to news reports and social media posts from neighbors, federal agents had been surveilling the property since March 12th. The warrant for his Los Angeles properties was approved at 2:47 p.m. on March 16th, but flight records showed federal transport planes landing at Burbank Airport at 6:30 a.m. that same day. More troubling were the evidence logs. Items seized from Combs' properties were logged into the federal evidence system before the warrants were even signed. In one case, a hard drive containing what prosecutors described as crucial evidence was logged at 9:23 a.m. on March 15th, 6 hours before the warrant was approved. This isn't just procedural errors, Karoline muttered to herself, staring at the timeline she had created. This is illegal search and seizure. They were collecting evidence before they had legal authority to do so. But that was just the beginning. As Karoline dug deeper, she found more inconsistencies. The chain of custody documents showed evidence being processed by technicians who weren't certified to handle digital forensics. Witness statements were dated before the witnesses were officially interviewed. Most damning of all, several key pieces of evidence appeared to have been discovered multiple times, with different serial numbers and different chain of custody records. At 3 a.m., exhausted but electrified by her findings, Karoline made a decision that would change everything. She picked up her secure phone and called someone she hadn't spoken to in 2 years, her former law school professor, now a federal judge, who had always told her she had the sharpest legal mind he'd ever encountered. Judge William Harrison answered his phone on the second ring, despite the late hour. At 67, he was one of the most respected jurists in the federal system, known for his meticulous attention to legal procedure and his absolute intolerance for prosecutorial misconduct. "Karoline?" His voice was groggy but concerned. "What's wrong?" "Judge Harrison, I need you to look at something, off the record, as my former professor, not as a sitting judge." For the next hour, Karoline walked Judge Harrison through her findings, reading dates and document numbers over the secure line. She could hear him taking notes, occasionally asking her to repeat a detail or clarify a timeline. The silence that followed her presentation was deafening. "Jesus Christ," Judge Harrison finally whispered. "Karoline, if what you're showing me is accurate, this isn't just prosecutorial misconduct. This is a pattern of constitutional violations that could invalidate the entire case." "That's what I thought, but I needed someone with more experience to confirm I wasn't crazy." "You're not crazy, you're brilliant, and you've just uncovered what could be the biggest prosecutorial scandal in federal court history." Judge Harrison paused. "But Karoline, you need to understand what you're walking into. Marcus Richardson isn't just any prosecutor. He's politically connected, media-savvy, and absolutely ruthless. If you're going to challenge him on this, you better be prepared for war." "I'm the White House press secretary," Karoline said quietly. "I'm already in one war. What's another?" Judge Harrison chuckled despite the gravity of the situation. "That's the Karoline I remember. But this is different. This could destroy careers, topple reputations, maybe even reach into the Justice Department itself. Are you sure you want to be the one to light this fuse?" Karoline looked at the evidence spread across her desk. Dozens of documents that painted a picture of systematic constitutional violations. She thought about all the defendants who might have been convicted based on illegally obtained evidence, all the families destroyed by prosecutorial misconduct, all the times justice had been perverted for the sake of securing convictions. "Judge," she said, her voice steady, "if I don't light this fuse, who will?" The next morning, Karoline stood at the familiar podium in the White House press room, but today felt different. The stakes were higher, the implications more far-reaching than any political controversy. She had spent the morning briefing White House counsel and getting approval for what she was about to do, not as a political attack, but as a legal professional with an obligation to report potential constitutional violations. "Before we begin with questions," Karoline said, her voice clear and steady, I want to address the comments made by District Attorney Richardson regarding my observations about the Combs case. The room fell silent. Reporters who had been chatting and checking phones suddenly focused entirely on her. Mr. Richardson suggested that I was unqualified to comment on legal proceedings. While I respect his experience, I want to clarify my background for those who may not be aware. Before entering politics, I spent 3 years as a litigation associate at Morrison, Klein, and Amp Associates, where I specialized in federal criminal defense and civil rights violations. I graduated summa cum laude from law school, where I was editor of the Law Review and wrote my thesis on prosecutorial misconduct in federal cases. She paused, letting that sink in. Several reporters were already typing furiously. More importantly, she continued, my observations were not political commentary but legal analysis based on publicly available court documents. And after reviewing these documents more thoroughly, I have discovered what appears to be systematic violations of Fourth Amendment protections in the collection of evidence against Mr. Combs. The room erupted. Hands shot up, voices called out questions, but Karoline held up her hand for silence. I have documented evidence showing that federal agents began surveillance and evidence collection before obtaining proper warrants. Items were logged into evidence systems hours before warrants were signed. Chain of custody procedures were violated. Witnesses were apparently interviewed before being officially contacted. She held up a thick folder. I have compiled 127 pages of documentation showing these violations, cross-referenced with public filings, news reports, and court records. I have shared this information with the White House counsel, who has forwarded it to the appropriate authorities for investigation. The bombshell was complete. Within minutes, legal Twitter exploded. Cable news shows interrupted programming for breaking news alerts. In his Manhattan office, Marcus Richardson watched in growing horror as his carefully constructed case began to crumble in real time. Richardson's response was swift and panicked. Within an hour of Karoline's press conference, he was back on television, this time less composed, his usual arrogance replaced by defensive anger. This is a politically motivated attack on a legitimate federal prosecution, he said on Fox News, sweat visible on his forehead, despite the studio's air conditioning. Ms. Leavitt is trying to relitigate a case from the White House podium, undermining the rule of law for political gain. But his denials rang hollow, as other legal experts began examining Karoline's evidence. Harvard law professor Elizabeth Chen appeared on CNN that evening with her own analysis. What Ms. Leavitt has uncovered appears to be systematic Fourth Amendment violations. If these timeline discrepancies are accurate, virtually every piece of evidence in the Combs case could be fruit of the poisonous tree. The dam burst completely when Judge Harrison, recusing himself from any potential involvement but speaking as a legal scholar, gave an interview to the Washington Post. In 40 years on the bench, I have never seen such comprehensive documentation of prosecutorial misconduct. This isn't about one case. This suggests a pattern of constitutional violations that demands immediate investigation. By Thursday morning, just 48 hours after Karoline's revelation, the FBI had announced an investigation into Richardson's office. The Justice Department's Office of Professional Responsibility opened its own inquiry. Richardson's political allies began distancing themselves, and rumors swirled about potential charges against prosecutors in his office. The final blow came when 3 former prosecutors from Richardson's office came forward with stories of being pressured to cut corners, ignore procedural requirements, and prioritize convictions over constitutional protections. Sarah Martinez, a former assistant prosecutor, told 60 Minutes, Marcus created a culture where the ends always justified the means. If you questioned his methods, you were labeled weak, unfit for prosecution work. On Friday afternoon, exactly 1 week after he had laughed at Karoline's amateur analysis, Marcus Richardson announced his resignation. Standing before a sparse crowd of reporters, many of his usual media allies had abandoned him. He looked nothing like the confident prosecutor who had dismissed Karoline so arrogantly. While I maintain that any procedural irregularities were inadvertent and do not undermine the integrity of our prosecutions, he said, his voice barely audible, I recognize that my continued service as district attorney would be a distraction from the important work of this office. He left without taking questions, his 30-year career in ruins. The fallout from what became known as the Leavitt revelations extended far beyond Richardson's office. The Justice Department launched a comprehensive review of federal prosecutions dating back 5 years, looking for similar patterns of constitutional violations. 17 federal cases were dismissed or sent back for review due to tainted evidence. 3 other prosecutors resigned under investigation. For Sean Combs, the revelation meant freedom, at least temporarily. While prosecutors promised to rebuild their case using only legally obtained evidence, legal experts agreed that the systematic violations Karoline had uncovered made successful prosecution nearly impossible. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the legal profession itself. Law schools began teaching the Combs case as an example of how prosecutorial zeal could undermine justice. Bar associations implemented new continuing education requirements focused on constitutional protections and proper evidence procedures. Karoline found herself in an unexpected position, celebrated not just as a political figure, but as a legal reformer. Harvard Law School offered her a visiting professorship. The American Bar Association invited her to deliver the keynote address at their annual convention. Publishers competed to sign her for a book about prosecutorial reform. "I never intended to become a legal reformer," she told CNN's Anderson Cooper in an interview 6 months later. "I was just doing what any lawyer should do when they see potential constitutional violations, bringing them to light." Cooper asked her about Richardson's initial dismissal of her qualifications. Karoline smiled. That same confident smile that had become her trademark, but tempered now with the gravity of what she had accomplished. "You know, in a way, I'm grateful for his arrogance," she said. "If he had taken my initial observations seriously, he might have quietly fixed the problems and continued violating defendants' rights. His dismissiveness forced me to dig deeper, to document everything thoroughly. Sometimes the best thing your opponents can do is underestimate you." The interview ended with Cooper asking about her future plans. Would she leave politics for law, return to prosecution, write the book everyone wanted her to write? "For now, I'm focused on my job as press secretary," Karoline said. "But I've learned something important through this experience. The law isn't just about winning cases or scoring political points. It's about protecting the constitutional rights that define who we are as Americans. Whether I'm standing at a White House podium or in a courtroom, that's a principle I'll never compromise." As the credits rolled, viewers across America reflected on a remarkable week that had seen a young press secretary take down one of the most powerful prosecutors in the country, not through political maneuvering or media manipulation, but through careful legal analysis and an unwavering commitment to constitutional principles. Marcus Richardson's laughter had lasted only moments, but its echo would serve as a warning to prosecutors across the nation. In America, no one is above the law, not even those sworn to enforce it. And sometimes, it takes an outsider with fresh eyes and an unshakable moral compass to remind the legal establishment of that fundamental truth. The case would be studied for decades, not just as an example of prosecutorial misconduct, but as proof that justice can still prevail when someone has the courage to speak truth to power, even when that power responds with condescending laughter. In the end, Karoline Leavitt had done more than expose corruption. She had restored faith in the idea that the Constitution still matters, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice is simply paying attention to the details that others choose to ignore.